Unit 6 of the story, The Fortune Teller, begins with the magistrate, Mr. Kelly, announcing the verdict on the charges leveled against Mrs. Meyer. He does not seem to be very happy with the way that Mrs. Meyer has been reading the cards, and he calls the manner of her fortune telling a fraud. He further goes on to tell Mrs. Meyer that card reading is not something to be taken as a trifle, but that it requires an understanding of the cards. And he again reiterates that the nine of spades, which Mrs. Meyer had predicted meant journeys, was not journeys according to him. And he tells her that since she had, in a way, duped people by not predicting their future correctly, she had to pay a fine of £50, very similar to how people adulterate food or how they sell worthless goods and a fine is imposed on them. Similarly, she too would have to pay a fine since she did not read the fortune of the people correctly with wisdom. He also goes on to tell or to sentence her or give the verdict that there was a suspicion that Mrs. Meyer was also engaged in some espionage activity, that is, spying. And before Mrs. Meyer could complete whatever she had to say in her defense, Mr. Kelly, the judge, continues to say that she, being an alien in this country and without having any proper means of livelihood, the authorities would have to use their powers which are vested in them and will have to have her deported. And he ends his verdict by saying that this case was a case where Mrs. Myers indulged in inaccurate fortune telling, which is quite disgraceful and unscrupulous. And he warns her to keep that in mind. Here the verdict ends with Mrs. Meyer being told that she would be deported and also that she had to pay a fine. The reaction of Mrs. Meyer was one of surprise and also disappointment because she did not know how she would lead her life now. And here ends Unit 6. Unit 7 begins with a conversation between Mr. Kelly and Detective McClear. Now, at this point, a year has already lapsed. These two characters meet after a lapse of 1 year. And after making some kind of a casual conversation, Mr. Kelly asks the detective about the well being of Mrs. McCleary. Mr. McCleary looked very glum also embarrassed and told Mr. Kelly that she had left him. The magistrate was shocked and astonished and surprised that such a young, graceful lady by, as Mrs. McCleary could take such an extreme step. Mr. McCleary continues and says that some young, bold, rich billionaire was crazy about Mrs. McCleary, and before Mr. McCleary could understand what was happening, or before he could try to stop her, the two of them had married and left for Melbourne, which was a country, a state that was pretty far, that is Australia. And he just helplessly makes a few gestures with his hands and says that his wife and this young man whom she had met had sailed together for Australia a week ago. And here ends the story of the fortune teller. And it only goes to prove that, as mentioned in Unit 1 of the story, the writer Carol Chopek had mentioned that this story was one where judgment was not made in accordance with the letter of law. And as we saw, that here Mr. Kelly makes a very subjective judgment according to what he thinks or according to what the officers thought, and not by the statute law. And the story only goes to prove that Mrs. Myers was right and correct in her reading of the cards. So here ends the story of the fortune teller.